Being asked to film a TV commercial for an airline sounds like a dream come true, and in every respect it was an incredible experience. One which involved not eating for 2 days, 3 tubs of glue, tears, and the magic of cinema. It all started when I was approached by a production company who were filming a TV commercial for the Spanish airline Volotea. They needed to find and fly an Airbus A319 or A320 indoors. Not only that, the models needed to actually look the part with some degree of scale detail. Unfortunately, airliners are not regularly modelled, and even those that could be found were definitely not designed to fly indoors. But the idea of taking part in a TV commercial was motivation enough not to give up. So I contacted my go-to guy, a walking RC encyclopedia, Carlos Marquez, best known as CM Jets for his Kevlar fuel tanks, and we included him in the project. We concluded that no ready-to-fly options were available, but Carlos had the solution. He remembered having seen a small scratch-built Airbus in a magazine years ago, and what's better, he remembered that the plan and build instructions were included in the magazine. Not only that, but he'd always wanted to build it, but never got around to it. He even ordered the EDF motors for both himself and a friend, and they'd been sitting on a shelf ever since the magazine came out. We went back to the production company, explained the situation, and they agreed that it would be best to build our own Airbus, based on the magazine drawings. Little did we know just how much of a nightmare this decision was going to become. 3 models were commissioned, and Carlos got to building. Except the deadline was already for yesterday. We initially had around 4 weeks before the shoot, but we'd used almost 2 in figuring out how to make it happen, especially since we'd also been asked to design a way to add RC to 10 of these. But more about that later. Carlos and I would struggle to be further apart yet still remain on the Spanish map. So unfortunately it was entirely up to him to do the actual building, the installing of the electronics, and performing a few test flights, all before creating the models up and shipping them to Barcelona, where I would see the models for the first time ready for filming. This also meant that when things started going wrong, we could discuss options on a video call, but when it came to the actual work, he was on his own, and things did start going wrong. Bad. Carlos soon discovered just how hard this project was, especially due to needing to make perfectly cylindrical Depron foam tubes for the fuselage, and somehow shaping the nose section to look like the right version of Airbus, all while keeping it light. Multiple attempts resulted in multiple failures, and just a couple of days prior to filming, Carlos wanted and tried to pull out, claiming it was an impossible task, especially in the time provided. But this far in, failure was no longer an option, with the production company pointing out that hundreds of thousands of euros were on the line, something we shrugged off as our budget for the build was tiny, and we just put it down to pressure tactics. In the end though, Carlos, he pulled through. Well, mostly. On the evening before the day that the models needed to be shipped, after a very long couple of nights and nervous radio silence from Carlos, a photo came through. It was of 2 Airbuses, with nicely cylindrical foam fuselages, ultra-thin 3D printed nose sections, looking good. That good news photo was followed up with a not so good phone call though. 2 of the 3 models are done, but electronics are not installed. Apparently, that would now be up to me to do in Barcelona. This is where the real problems started though. Not only were the electronics not installed, but Carlos had misplaced or miscalculated what electronics we needed. Servos, wires and batteries I could pick up from my local hobby shop en route to Barcelona, but the motors, I was now told, are so old that they're not even brushless. Where on earth am I going to find brushed speed controllers in under a day? No model shop I spoke to had anything brushed. Amazon came to the rescue though, with next day delivery before 1 PM. With the crisis averted, it was time to get a good night's sleep, as the following day I'd go to work, and in the afternoon, once Amazon had delivered, I would drive the 5-6 hours to Barcelona, ready to then have one day to build and test the models before filming. Did I say it was time for a good night's sleep? I meant it was time for a phone call from the production company. The director had seen the photo of the 2 finished Airbuses, and as somewhat of a plane junkie himself, he identified the models more of a A318 with a much shorter body to wing ratio than either the A319 or A320 that the airline uses. Several urgent phone calls later, Carlos casually drops into the conversation that even though he had adapted the A318 magazine plan to an A319, he also stretched the wingspan to help with the wing loading for flying indoors, increasing it by 33%. Collection had already been postponed a couple of times. The shipment had to go in the morning, and rebuilding the fuselage or the wing to scale was impossible in the time frame. So we agreed that Carlos would produce another couple of foam tubes, include them in the box, and it would just be something else I would have to do on arriving in Barcelona. Basically, splitting the current fuselage into 3 sections and splicing the extra tubes in to make the fuzz 33% longer and more to scale. This all went down like a lead balloon, especially given that it wasn't exactly our first failure of the shoot, rather the second. Remember I mentioned about adding radio to 10 of these? Well, they didn't need to fly, obviously, but they did need some of them to have a scale landing gear, and others needed to be driven like an RC car. The scale landing gear sounded easy, so Carlos 3D printed the gear ready to be attached. But as you'll be guessing by now, it wasn't that easy. Being so small, a truly scale gear was impossible to print. Carlos redesigned a slightly less scale version with thicker struts, but to the same result. No matter how many times it was scaled up and printed, same problem. Trying with a friend's resin printer solved the issue of the print quality, but the diameter of the strut, even in a scaled up version, was still too flimsy. And these are surprisingly heavy. And they kept breaking. So the static versions ended up getting a 3mm bolt and superglued wheels. Not exactly scale as requested. But that's not the worst. After weeks of trying for an RC version, trying everything from cannibalizing miniature RC cars, which then didn't have the power to drive due to the weight, or using our standard radio equipment and 2 servos with the pots removed, all without avail, Carlos scrapped the whole RC version after weeks of testing, only 2 days prior to filming. Only for the director, the one that likes aviation, used to fly RC, and still has friends in the hobby, well, he had one of his friends knock up a working version in just a couple of hours, based off of exactly the same design that Carlos had tried of the potless servos. To say we didn't look good to the production company at this point was an understatement. Anyway, it's almost filming day. The Amazon brushed speed controllers have arrived and I'm heading to Barcelona. I pick up my good friend Julian, who's going to be flying the second Airbus, as they now want them both flying at once. Julian is not only a good friend and pilot, he's a brilliantly efficient electrician and problem solver. And based on all the work we had ahead of us to get both planes airborne, that problem solving and not being afraid to double down and get things done is going to be worth his weight in gold. En route, we stopped at our local hobby shop, where, after explaining our dilemma, agrees to us effectively emptying half their shop into the back of my car, on the promise that we'll bring back anything we don't use and pay for everything that we do. We took double the number of servos we planned to need: wires, extensions, heat shrinks, carbon rods, tubes, metal rods, glues, lipos in multiple sizes, and all kinds of small replacement brushless motors, their respective brushless speed controllers, and even there are only 2 pairs of brushless EDF units in the shop. And they even seem to be about the right size that we need. Confident we had everything we would need, we arrived at our hotel in Barcelona at close to 2 AM, ready to get up early the next morning, have breakfast, and head to the production company's art studio for 10 AM when the courier would be dropping the models off. Once we were able to get into the box and pull the planes out, it was abundantly obvious that the current shape and size was way off. But we knew what had to be done, so we just got on with it. Cutting the seemingly finished models into sections, ready to insert the extra fuselage tubes both in front and behind the wing in a proportion that would return the model to scale while also keeping the right CG. Somehow, though, the spare tubes from Carlos were smaller than the ones used for the fuselage, so not only did we struggle to align everything in the first place, but we also had to keep adding extra chunks in order to get the right diameter. Tube hiccup aside though, the rest of the build went relatively well, and in more or less good time. Sure, it was absolutely freezing in the metal shed, even having to put the heater's gas bottle in front of the fire to prevent it from freezing. But come midday, we'd managed to extend both models and install all the electronics. The only thing missing was the landing gear, as Carlos had run out of time for his printer to finish the job, and instead sent the file to the production company to print on location. So for now, temporarily, we attached a couple of Depron skids for testing until the gear was ready. At this point, we had to head to the sports hall where the filming was taking place. The production team were waiting eagerly to see a test fly, and we had no time to spare. So we packed up the car, foregoing lunch, expecting a quick couple of test flights each, and then a well-deserved steak dinner in the evening at a restaurant that Julian had found while en route to the sports hall. After brief introductions and niceties, it was the moment of truth. Time to fly the first Airbus and really kick-start our nightmare. The magazine very clearly stated, albeit in French, that the brushed motors they used ran and flew well on a small 2S LiPo. So we installed one into the model, checked that the surfaces all worked, checked that the motors worked, checked that the CG was as per the magazine, and we set her down on the ground ready for that first flight. I walk over to the centre of the hall, power up slowly, and absolutely nothing happens. Not even a noise. It turns out that the Amazon brushed speed controller and Beck failed catastrophically. Thankfully, it did so before getting airborne, but this was definitely not the start we wanted. We explain everything to production and they will be replacing the speed controller for another one. And not long later, we're ready to go again. This time, having left the model connected for about 15 minutes, making sure the new speed controller doesn't fail the same way the first one did. I walk out again, slowly increase power, all seems to be working. Keep increasing power, we reach full power, and the model never moved. So much for running on 2S. Just in case though, we added some slippery tape to the skids for reduced friction, but all to the same end. All we could do was increase the battery to a larger 3S LiPo. This time it made more noise, but each time it started wanting to move, the tiny prop fan unit would spin off from the motor. After all, it's only a push-on fit and it's been sitting assembled on Carlos's shelf since brushed motors were a thing, and the plastic's obviously given way. We tried sanding the hub and gluing the fan in place, but each time we reached a decent amount of thrust, bing! There goes the fan unit again. Time is going quickly, and the production company are looking ever more concerned, given that the first of the two Airbus is yet to even move under its own power, let alone fly. It was time to bite the bullet and go for overkill. The small brushed GWS 50mm fans obviously were not going to work, and we picked up from our local shop two sets of brushless fans, a 48mm set and a 52mm set. We obviously needed power, so decided to install the 52mm set into the first Airbus. This meant swapping out the brushed ESC for brushless versions, rewiring everything, but we were confident it would get us flying. Sometime later, I was walking back to the centre of the hall, optimistic this thing was now finally going to fly. And I guess I was right. It did leave the ground, and with basically no control or stability, it did one circuit, knife edging its way down the far wall before coming down again. Production saw this as a win. It flew. But Julian and I knew we had big problems. It didn't fly slowly. It had little to no control over its direction. It was massively unstable, and it really didn't want to fly. Never to be disheartened, we spent the next few hours trying and tweaking, making adjustments and alterations in the hope we could get this first of the two Airbus working right. Time after time, the single circuit laps were seeing a marginal improvement, but with such limited control, such an unstable airframe, and in such a little space in which to fly it, each attempt was costing us more and more repairs. The production company left us to it by mid-evening, and it was now coming up to 1 AM. We increased the surface area of the wing both on the leading edge and trailing edge. We increased the surface area on the elevator and rudder on their trailing edges. We've significantly oversized the ailerons, elevators and rudder. We changed the engine incidences, the battery location, CG. We even glued in permanent flaps attached to the ailerons to try and gain some airflow control. You must be thinking that after hours and hours of test flights and all these changes, we must have it all sorted, right? It was marginally better than it started, and we could now usually limp around a single circuit before causing damage on landing. Each test was causing more and more damage, and we were plain out of ideas. We haven't eaten since breakfast, and yet we're so focused and nervous that eating was still the last thing on our minds. It came at a time when we had to make the decision that it wasn't going to get any better, and we would have to fight it as best we could when the camera was rolling. Once we reached that point though, we still had the second Airbus to replace the motors on, swapping out the fan units, upgrading the speed controllers, and making all the alterations that we'd done to the first one, all on the second one. By the time we did all of this, it was past 3 AM. We didn't see the point of flying it, as it had smaller motors than the first one, which could hardly fly even on the bigger engines. Plus, we had to get back to the hall by 6 AM, when shooting was scheduled to start. We headed back to the hotel for the couple of hours we had. Not that we could sleep, just thinking of what would happen if the film crew couldn't get the flying shots they needed. How are we going to fly these? And how are we going to fly the second, yet untested model that had even smaller motors than the first? And how either of them will fly once the art department ply them both with all the vinyl stickers with Volotea's livery on them? Still, with nothing in our stomachs, we arrived on set at 6 AM to discover that the hundreds of thousands of euros that this was costing may not be an exaggeration after all. The equipment that had already been set up, the number of people, the stages that had been prepared for filming, the cinema camera, the cine lenses. This shoot truly was a big deal. And we have one plane that doesn't want to fly, and one that likely won't fly at all. We're greeted by the owner of the production company, the owner of the advertising company, and even the owner of the airline. Forget the on-site buffet breakfast, which we still couldn't face. If we could have run away, we would have done. The advert itself portrays the company's Airbus life, starting off small all the way through their first flights before finally embarking on passenger flights. And the day started off with filming the early scenes from the advert, and we needed to control the miniature RC models in multiple scenarios. Our flights are to be recorded after lunch, which was held on site. Once again though, with imminent failure looming, we tried to eat but couldn't. And I ended up pulling out a foamy that I had with me to actually fly something decent and subconsciously probably show everyone that we actually do know what we're doing, despite what it may seem up to this point. Thankfully, the director could see and appreciate how difficult it was to do what they were asking of us, and eventually decided that trying to get both in the air at the same time was going to be practically impossible. So we agreed that I would basically take off and fly as much as I could with a single plane and perform a single long shot that they could then cut down as required, rather than risk multiple short flights and crash landings. Ready to go, we placed the first Airbus at the beginning of the hall, this time loaded with the Volotea livery and for the first time with the 3D printed landing gear and wheels. The set goes silent. The director shouts action. I increase power. Unfortunately though, the art department who installed the landing gear used a super soft thin metal pin as a wheel axle, resulting in the wheel not being able to spin, turning the model sideways and aborting the takeoff. We tried this a few times. Everyone is watching, until on one of those attempts the Airbus stays straight and she took to the air. Unfortunately though, the non-turning wheels seemingly offered more resistance than the skids used previously, and that resulted in using more of the hull than usual to take off, which then resulted in not having enough room to turn in time before planting the model against the far wall. It was the final nail in the coffin, and that first Airbus, the one that we knew did fly, albeit not very well, the one that had the big engines, was now out of action. At this point, I'm resigned to failure. I'm left with an untested model, with the same silly wheels that don't work, and smaller motors than the one that could barely keep aloft. It obviously has little to no chance of taking off from the ground, and even if it does, it won't make the turn before smacking into the same wall the previous one did. The only option we have is for Julián to hand launch it, untested, from the top of the scoreboard, all in the hope that even if we could somehow get one single solitary circuit, they may be able to edit it enough that it works. Very much an all or nothing moment. Once again, everyone goes quiet in expectation. Action! I increase power. Julián gently pushes the Airbus away. She wiggles, she turned, and somehow completes a lap. At this point, I'm flying this thing until it falls out of the sky. Keep that camera rolling because the chances are this is going to be our only chance. Miraculously, it stayed in the air lap after lap after lap, with full rudder, full aileron and full elevator to keep it turning. Even if slowly it was sliding more and more off centre before eventually clipping a wall. But even that couldn't stop it. I idled back and landed as best I could, to a roar of applauses and cheers, followed by the entire crew coming over to shake our hands. It was hugs all around. Me? I almost dropped my radio the second the Airbus touched down, and then spent the next 10 minutes crying. The relief, the satisfaction, the achievement, it was unbelievable. We'd actually managed it, somehow, despite all the issues, and not having eaten or slept for 2 days, the plane had flown at what was very much its very last chance. The director subsequently pulled me aside and with his arm around me concluded his appreciation for all that we'd done, closing with, "The magic of cinema, it's real." Now, I don't know if it was magic or a miracle. I'm just so pleased it worked out, and boy do we have a story to tell, and this is still the short version. The end result makes it all look easy, even if it does barely last 2 seconds on screen. After allowing the nerves to calm down, we sat back and enjoyed watching how the final shots of the advert were filmed. I'll include a link to the full advert on Volotea's YouTube channel below. But first, a big thanks, especially to my friend Julián, for joining me on this adventure. I couldn't have got it all done without you. And Carlos, we'll have to have words when we meet up again next, my friend. But thank you anyway for the half-finished models. So Julián, you got away with it last time. Today it's your turn.
Okay, thank you. I will try it.
You can tell the difference when you got space, eh?
Yes, with space a little better to fly.